Hey everyone, welcome to Story Trading weekly meetup. We're back here on Monday night. We got a special program. We're going to be talking about cannabis stocks, but first, quick disclaimer: Story Trading is not an investment advisor. Investing in securities involves significant risk of loss. This event is being recorded. It'll be provided to our VIP members for about 1 week time exclusively, and then we'll be posting it up on social media. So tonight we want to talk about cannabis stocks. The future of cannabis stocks. And the reason this sparked our interest is because we've been tracking this ETF, MSOS, and it's just been killed. And there's been a few people in our community who have expressed interest in this sector. So Matt S. From our community hooked us up with, well, first of all, we're looking at this as we go through this tonight to learn more about the cannabis sector. Obviously, we're doing that from the story trading perspective. Where's my animation? It's not working. But anyway, to learn about the sentiment, catalyst, fundamentals behind all of the price actions that was supposed to animate. So Matt hooked us up with Aaron Edelheit, CEO of Mindset Capital. So he should be here with us. I'm going to stop my share. Are you there, Aaron? There you are.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. So yeah, Mindset Capital, Matt, who made the intro, tells us that you guys invest in cannabis, you know, all about cannabis. So definitely want to learn more about your fund, and you can give us your perspective on where the stocks are now, like why MSOS is so low, and if the sector is going to be going up, what we can look forward to. Love an intro from you. And then if we have time, we'll take some questions from the audience.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for having me on. And what I would let me just give some disclaimers, is that I encourage everyone to do their own due diligence. Please don't rely on anything that I say to make your own decisions. Investing is hard enough. And to also give the perspective that I'm wrong. And sometimes I'm wrong a lot. So, you know, part of investing is learning and trying to learn from your mistakes. And that's what I'm generally trying to do. I'll also give a further warning that investing in small or micro cap stocks can be very dangerous to your financial health, especially ones where it's federally illegal to be in that business, which is the US cannabis stocks. Any cannabis stock that touches the plant, you are federally illegal. And because of that, you don't really have access to the federal banking system. You don't really have institutional investors. You trade on secondary and tertiary Canadian exchanges. You trade over the counter. These stocks can be very illiquid. And when sentiment goes bad, like it has over the past 18 months, it can be very bad because there just isn't a lot of capital. There isn't a lot of institutional capital. Now, all that being said, that actually attracts me because I like when you have an opportunity where there isn't a lot of competition. I like when there's not a lot of eyeballs looking at stuff, or specifically doing deep dive research, which is what I do. I do deep dive research. I form an opinion on the company, and then I hold it for a while. And I try not to trade, especially with small and illiquid stocks. I don't recommend trading. It's much harder to get in and out. So I like to just make my investment and then watch and see if the thesis changes or doesn't change, et cetera. My thesis on cannabis is the US cannabis stocks and the US cannabis industry is being normalized much faster than it's being legalized. And it's being legalized on a state level basis, while the federal government is lagging behind. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity. You have a $100 billion in sales industry that I think over time is going to a $200 billion industry, and that there's going to be potentially very, very large cannabis companies, and that at some point it's going to be legalized or decriminalized to the point at which these companies can trade on the large exchanges. You could use credit cards at dispensaries. They'll have access to the banking system, and you'll have institutional participation in the sector. The last thing I'll say is that it's totally absurd that cannabis is federally illegal and that it is classified as a Schedule I drug with no medicinal benefit, which is just patently false. There's many studies that show, and this is why lots of people use it for pain relief. It helps kids with seizures, and it also, there's just many different uses. It's paired really well with cancer drugs. There's been some really interesting studies around that it helps against COVID. And there's just a tremendous amount of research showing that it actually has medicinal benefits. And the fact that it's at a higher schedule, which means that supposedly it is worse for you than fentanyl, and it is absurd. And if you go back and you study the history of how did cannabis become illegal in the United States, it used to be a regularly prescribed thing in the US because it offers pain relief. And lots of people in life have pain relief. And I have this wonderful picture of a bottle from Eli Lilly from the early 1900s, where the first ingredient was cannabis. And suddenly cannabis became marijuana in the 1930s when Texas wanted to stop immigration of Mexicans into the US. And then there became a lot of scare tactics, a lot of propaganda, and it culminated in Richard Nixon convening a commission for the war on drugs. And even his advisor, so he actually had a commission saying, we're going to have this Controlled Substances Act. Should cannabis be on there? And he packed the commission with conservatives. They came back and said, no, actually, it should be decriminalized. It should be regulated and controlled, whatever. He overrode his own conservative committee, placed it as a Schedule I drug, and many years later, one of his chief aides actually admitted before he died that Nixon used cannabis as a way to target the African-American community and for hippies against the Vietnam War. So you have this just totally absurd thing where cannabis is illegal federally for the worst reasons. I don't even use the word marijuana because I think because of its, frankly, its racial history and how it's been used incorrectly. Do I think that cannabis is the greatest thing since sliced bread and it has no negative side effects? No, of course, anything you use in the extreme can be bad. But last year, there were 0 overdoses from cannabis. 0. 100,000 people die every year from alcohol-related deaths, and over 100,000 people die from opioid overdoses. And if you wanted to decrease, we have an opioid epidemic in this country. And if you wanted to decrease, they have studies on this. You want to decrease the number of opioid prescriptions. Whenever a state legalizes cannabis, opioid prescriptions fall 27% in the first year. And after 4 years, it's near 40%. And so what you find when you read the data and you study the data, you find that cannabis is the great substitute. You find that workers' comp claims fall because people don't get injured. Why? Because they're using really toxic things to self-medicate. You find that auto insurance claims fall. People don't drunk drive as much. And there's all these benefits, and this is actually driving state legalization. And that's why state after state, and then what happens as the state legalizes, everyone watches, they expect the world to, to blow up, and nothing bad happens. In fact, everything gets a little better. You have tax revenue and jobs and better outcomes for people who are using really terrible things. And what happens is the state next to it says, like, wait a minute, why don't we do that? And that's leading from state to state to state to legalize to the point where it's almost most of the country is either medicinal or adult use. And there's all kinds of weird things in the cannabis space. Like every state is its own country. So they don't allow cannabis to cross state lines. And the reason they say this is because it's federally illegal, but it's actually unconstitutional what they're doing, and it violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. I'm throwing a lot of stuff out to you just to show there's a lot of complexity, that you have state-run businesses, and then you have companies that are called multi-state operators, and that's where the MSOS, multi-state operators with the S, comes from. And those are cannabis companies that are basically operating one state and then another, and they're duplicating everything in those states. And some of those states have limited licenses, some of them have unlimited licenses, some of them have very different rules. Like in Florida, you can't sell anybody else's cannabis. If you want to open a dispensary, you have to have your own farm. If you want to sell vapes, or anything else, you have to have your own manufacturing. So it's forced vertical integration. And so there's a lot of like strange things in the industry and a lot of challenges. And the biggest challenge has been that there's just no federal reform. And that the biggest worry is, what if it takes kind of forever? One of the reasons why it's down so much is the industry went on an enormous run when the Democrats took power. And they were expecting in 2020, Biden to be very pro-cannabis. In fact, he ran in the presidential primaries on this. But it turns out that he has not moved on cannabis. And the Democrats have kind of played political football with it. And just not really moved on it. The combination of higher interest rates, inflation, capital coming out of the market. And then what's happened is a lot of the main companies that make up the MSOS index operate in limited license states where more and more competition has been coming. And so more and more competition, more supply, the price of cannabis has been falling in many of these markets. And you have higher costs, falling prices. It's a bad combination with debt that is being repriced higher. And so it's created a lot of pain in cannabis. But to me, I think this is a time, frankly, a time for opportunity. And that what I have focused on, and I used to believe that the longer it took for federal reform to happen, the stronger these larger MSOs would be. And I've changed my opinion after watching what they've reported, how they've performed. And I'm now much more focused on smaller companies that I think have demonstrated competitive advantages, specifically on the cost side. And so where I've oriented my portfolio is to much smaller companies that are frankly more cost efficient, more nimble, and have demonstrated that they can perform in very difficult environments. And so that's kind of a summary. Just as a background, I run two funds, a friends and family value fund that has about 40% in cannabis, and then I have a dedicated cannabis fund. And last year I did terrible. So just a warning. So take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. But that being said, despite doing terrible, I'm very optimistic, because one of the things is like with cannabis is I don't think the returns are like, oh, you'll double your money. I mean, I think that if you could be patient and you can withstand tremendous volatility, that in some of these names, the returns could be in the thousands of percentage points.
Wow.
And that's why I'm doing research. And that's why I'm spending so much time, and I'm so fascinated by the industry.
Oh, well, thanks for that overview. I do have a bunch of questions, and if anyone else in the audience has questions, you can raise your hand or get a chat. But I'm wondering, Aaron, if you can give us a little overview of, when people talk about cannabis stocks, the most popular names that come out, first of all, is Tilray, TLR.
No. Let's just stop right there.
Yeah.
I am not talking about Canadian cannabis companies.
Right. So tell us the
any
difference.
Canadian. So the big difference is, I'll give you a small example. California by itself is larger than all of Canada. And more money has been lit on fire in Canada from the cannabis. They cannot grow good cannabis, most of them. And they are completely unprofitable, and they're switching to do other things. I am not, and some of them are still having failed harvests.
Interesting.
You know, everything I'm looking on is the opportunity is in the US. That's where I'm focused. That's where the opportunity is. That's where the good growers are. That's where cannabis, if you think about, I mean, Justin Bieber, like, I get my weed from California, right? He isn't saying I get my weed from Canada. Because that's where the good cannabis, that's where the consumers are. And so I do not look at any of the Canadian companies. I think they have inflicted unbelievable amounts of pain.
Why? I don't know a lot about I don't know a lot about the history of cannabis. I only recently started exploring it, but why do you think there's so much hype around the Canadian companies? Why?
You know why? This is why. It's federally legal in Canada to sell cannabis and to grow it. Because of that, Canadian companies can list on US stock exchanges because it's not violating any law. And so they were able to list in the US and act as if there were plays on US cannabis opportunity when they had no licenses and no operations. And they were terrible at what they did.
Okay. All right. So tell me, like, for someone who's not invested in cannabis yet, what do you recommend?
Run.
No,
I'm just kidding.
I mean, you have your fund. I don't know. Yeah, obviously people want to learn more about your fund. They can go to where they go to.
Yeah, I'm not, I guess you could reach out. You have to be an accredited investor. This is not a pitch for my fund.
Right. Okay.
Anyway,
if you're an accredited investor, you could reach out, find them on Twitter. But for everyone else,
but this is not I just want to be very careful. This is not a solicitation. I am not soliciting for money here.
Absolutely. No, yeah, It's not a solicitation at all. I just wanted to give you that courtesy. But so where do we get started? Is it just MSOS the best way to do this? Or you said the smaller names, like, point us in the right direction?
Well, I can only tell you what I'm invested in and why I'm invested in. And so I've been looking for US cannabis companies that I think have been demonstrating something special. So I'll give you one example. There's a company called MRMD. The stock ticker is MRMD. And they are a much smaller MSO. That means they're in multiple states. And I believe that they are demonstrating special performance. What does I mean? What do I mean by that? So Massachusetts was a state that used to be limited license and has become very competitive. And so the prices in Massachusetts have come down quite a bit. Used to sell for $4,000 a pound in Massachusetts, cannabis on the wholesale market. And now it's like $1,500 or lower. Many companies are having tremendous pain in Massachusetts because it didn't matter what your cost was when it was $4,000. But it matters now that the price is falling. And it didn't really matter how great your cannabis was when there was so much demand and not enough supply. People would just buy whatever was available. Now that there's competition and people are complaining, the largest company out there, Curaleaf, is pulling out capacity. I know many others that are shuttering capacity. You have MRMD. And so how is it? I just hosted an interview. One thing I should know is that I write a newsletter. And I could put it in the chat here. If anyone, I write a free newsletter. And I'll just post it last week on MRMD. I did an interview with the CFO. They are expanding capacity. They cannot they are selling out of their cannabis in one of the more competitive markets. And they're selling it for significantly higher than the average price. Then you ask, like, why? How is that? It turns out they're selling a niche quality flower, a craft flower that is in crazy demand. They're producing what people want at a very high quality, and they're the #1 flower in Massachusetts last year, despite lots of competition. They also have something called Betty's Eddies, which is the #1 edible in Massachusetts. And what they're trying to do is just build like real brands, whether it's flower, edibles, you're getting into drinks with this product called Vibations. They're about to turn on a number of assets where they have demonstrated what I consider operational excellence, which is producing super high quality products that consumers demand. They're just going to introduce that into other markets in a very low cost way. But even further, what I love is they operated a very clean balance sheet, and they were very conservative until now. They just announced a very big debt deal at the exact point that a lot of firms are experiencing pain and retrenching. MRMD is now going on the hunt. And I just really like that. I think that the company is undervalued, and I think over the next 2 years, it has an opportunity to potentially triple revenue.
I see this 35 million credit facility was just announced.
But it's actually
last
65.
week.
It's actually go in the 8K, and it could be upsized to 65 million. And it may not sound like a lot, but in cannabis, companies are struggling to raise 3 million, much less 65 million. That's how tight the capital markets are in cannabis. And then another company that I would, probably my biggest position is GLASF. The symbol is GLASF. And what they are is they're a single state operator. They only operate in California. And they have turned on the world's largest greenhouse in the world, in God's gift to the environment. You'll see that it was up a lot today. There was big news from the state of California. I'll explain it in a second. So they have turned on the world's largest state-of-the-art greenhouse that I believe gives them cost advantages that cannot be easily duplicated. And California is an unlimited license state. And over the past 18 months, there's been tremendous pain in California because the prices fell below the marginal cost of production. And so what that means is, while cannabis is selling for $2,500 a pound in Illinois, like $6,000 or $7,000 a pound in New Jersey, and even in a tough market like Massachusetts, $1,500 a pound, prices got as low as $375 a pound in California. And so this has been a wave of bankruptcies, farms shutting down, supply shutting down. And when Glass House turned on this facility, they were able in the back half of last year to get their costs down to $134 a pound. And so they're trying a very different thing is, can we lower costs as much as possible so that, and they have no choice, right? So that when we're allowed to, not only can we win in California, which by itself is the largest cannabis market in the world, as I said, larger than Canada, but we can supply the US. And so they have 5.5 million square feet. They've turned on about 20% of it. And their revenue, their margins are improving, everything despite a very difficult market. But at the same time, cannabis is a commodity, right? So if I told you that, you remember when the price of oil went negative, Saudi Arabia lost money, right? Saudi Arabia lost money when oil crashed, but Saudi Arabia was the lowest cost producer, and you knew that oil can't stay negative for very long or stay at a very low price, because what will happen? People stop producing it. People stop drilling for it. Guess where oil is today? it's back to a level where people can make a decent return on their marginal cost of production. And it kind of trades in a band. And so right now, cannabis in California has been far below the marginal cost of production. And what that has led to is a lot of supply coming out. Over 14 million square feet of cultivation has not renewed their licenses. Supply has come out. And what's fascinating now is prices are now starting to sharply rebound in California in response to that. And now when I talk to many private cultivators, they tell me there's no supply, there's no inventory, which is a very weird thing to say at this time of the year. We should have an oversupply after the big outdoor harvest, also affectionately known as Croptober, which hits the market November, December. So you shouldn't have prices rising now, but they are. And you should have people, lots of people on inventory, but there's no capital in cannabis. There's no capital available. So you can't fund losses for very long. So I'm very bullish on Glasshouse in the kind of rebound in the California market. And this morning, the main reason and this is one of the reasons I said thousands of percentage points, is if Glasshouse can eventually produce 1.5 million pounds, which is full capacity of their facility, and there's structural advantages to the weather. It's like average temperatures are like 70 degrees. They have a robot that cleans the roof. They have tall ceilings that allow them to control the temperature. There's all these things where you just can't get to their cost structure and quality. But if they can produce 1.5 million pounds and eventually get the cost at $100 a pound, it becomes a math exercise. Now, 1.5 million is way too big for California, but not for the US. And then the question is, well, what does Glasshouse sell the flower for? It's probably not $400 or $500. Illicitly on the street in New York City, if you wanted to go to any of the 12 to 1400 illicit cannabis dispensaries that have popped up, it's selling for $6,000 to $7,000 on the streets in New York right now. Now, that's not where the price of cannabis will normalize. But if you just run the math, I'm going to input X dollar price, $500, $700, $1,000, $100, 1.5 million pounds. There's only 80 million shares. And you just run the math, and you can come up with some crazy numbers for a stock that's $2.50, where they can earn more than $5 a share in earnings. Now, that is in an interstate commerce scenario where it's allowed to kind of leave the kind of, they could sell to the US. And I'm going to put just here in the chat, I just wrote a whole long piece. California is starting to move forward on interstate commerce. I think it's actually very big news. And I think it starts the ball rolling for knocking down the rules that are stopping cannabis from crossing state lines. I believe it's unconstitutional what's going on. And that you can read the story. I can go on and on and on and bore you to death with all of those details. The last company that I will just say that's really interesting, and this is very, very illiquid, so please, please, please be careful with this one, is there's a small Oregon company that's doing very interesting things called Grown Rogue. And it is about as illiquid as you get. And the stock ticker is GRUSF. So please, please, this is something, if you're going to buy, just assume you're going to own it forever or for a long time. But they're able to produce a super high quality craft indoor flower for all in for less than $600 a pound. Now, Glasshouse is doing greenhouse, not as high quality. Grown Rogue is, the state of Oregon has the lowest retail pricing for cannabis in the country. And Grown Rogue is free cash flow positive in Oregon. They then entered Michigan for only $3.5 million and in 2 years became a top 5 flower producer, and they're free cash flow positive, while other companies are announcing terrible losses and howling in pain because prices are collapsing. When you're the low-cost producer and you've got operational efficiency, there's enormous opportunity. And with all the distress in cannabis right now, I expect Grown Road to take advantage of this, to enter new states. It's only about a $20 million market cap. And I think that there's the potential for them to do very well as a craft cannabis company. All they do is flower right now. So they have an intense focus. Last thing I'll say is the CEO's office is the worst office I've ever seen. It's not even an office. It's an open air room with no doors outside the grow facility. And what that tells you, what tells me, is just kind of a Jeff Bezos style of very lean cost structure. And they are built to withstand the worst because they had no choice in Oregon. And when they enter some of these limited licenses where other people are pulling back, I think they're going to have a field day. And so those are three kind of companies that I've looked at. And the last thing I see a question someone asked just about my own personal experience with cannabis. So what really drives me for cannabis is not only doing all the research on the science on this and how many people can be helped by this, but I suffer from bouts of insomnia that I wouldn't wish on my own worst enemy. And my life has been completely helped so much by having a low dose cannabis gummy, specifically with CBN, which is a different cannabinoid than THC, which helps with sleep. And now just knowing that it's in my cabinet and that if I can't go to sleep, I can take it has been life altering to a father with 3 kids. And so
I know how that can be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I really believe that it's a net benefit to society. I think cannabis should be regulated. I think you should be very careful with young kids. I don't think I am only interested in regulated legal cannabis for over 21 consumption. And I think that what it also shows, the last thing I'll say is, again, I have 3 small kids, so this is something important to me. Teenage use falls wherever cannabis is legalized. And so you'll hear a lot of scary things around cannabis, but the data just doesn't really follow it up. And the last thing is, there is also this reefer madness around psychosis, that somehow there was a link with cannabis, and none of the data shows that state legalization leads to any change in levels of psychosis or things like that. And so anyway, that's just, how I look at it. And what I would encourage everyone to do is, if this sector is interesting to you, you have to consider 2 things. You have to fully, and I'm just going to repeat this again, you have to fully understand that to own a US cannabis company is owning an incredibly illiquid small and micro cap stock that may move up or down for no real reason, just because someone wants to get in or out. So you really have to understand what you own and the risks. But if you're willing to do the work and own them and be patient, I believe you'll have a leg up over many institutional investors who are not allowed to participate, and many other investors, even like me, that have the pressure to perform.
Well, I really like these 3 names you gave us. At StoryTrading, we like to look at fundamentals, catalyst, sentiment. And if you get like more than one of those things at a time, that's great. You have the recent catalyst with GLASF, with the California legislation. You have the financing, $65 million with MRMD. That's great. I just looked at the earnings on GRUSF. They did 571,000 net income last quarter,
which is very rare in cannabis.
Adjusted EBITDA, right? That's trading at like 8 times earnings sequentialized on net income, even lower on adjusted EBITDA. So very interesting 3 companies. I like all of those names. So definitely thank you so much. There is one question from John,
Sure.
if we could take that.
Sure,
John,
of
go ahead.
course.
Hey, thanks, Aaron. Great overview of cannabis. And hats off to you for
Thank
staying
you.
so optimistic with a sector that's just been completely, hammered.
Destroyed. Yeah,
Yeah.
destroyed.
So I just wanted to kind of talk about, as far as like as an investor of cannabis, how should we, and you kind of touched upon it, and I think MRMD is a perfect example in contrast to Glasshouse. Should we as investors look at it more so in the lines of, oh, eventually all the states will open up and there'll be interstate commerce? So then we have to
That's
think
my
about,
belief. That's my belief. Yes.
yes, and not
Yeah.
the current strategy, which was to look state by state, figure out where the limited liability, limited license states were versus others that were, more open. So you're saying a glass house would be a better opportunity then?
So what I would say is, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure that's an either or. So a company like MRMD, what they're simply doing is they're like, hey, we make great products that
Right.
resonate with consumers. And we're just going to bring that to other states. Right now, MRMD has to reproduce the facilities in every state. But there's nothing to say that in interstate commerce, their Betty's Eddies could be available everywhere. And I know that it's a great product that resonates with consumers. And we know that brands can be very valuable. There are very few actual brands in cannabis. What Glasshouse is doing is just very different, which is we're going to make really good weed, really good cannabis, and we're going to make it for a price that no one can touch. In longer term, their strategy is they're going to try to layer on brands on this very low cost source of input, right? But right now, what Glasshouse is really trying to do is win in California and then win in the country based on growing really good cannabis at an unbelievable price. And so what MRMD is doing is different. What Grown Rogue is doing is different. And they're just different strategies. And the reality is that I think they can both work. I'm not entirely sure, but what I am convinced on is that if you control your costs and you can deliver value to the consumer, and your goal isn't, I'm going to exploit limited licenses that only have a short-term duration, I believe that's a better strategy.
Let me play devil's advocate.
Sure.
If we did have interstate commerce though, wouldn't it end up just being a price war and a cost war, where essentially like a state like Texas or, some of the southern states could end up winning out because, you can get cheap land, cheap labor, the costs, the CapEx would be a lot lower. Wouldn't that be the case? Or do you just think
It's
that
really
California
interesting
is
to
so
say
far
that.
ahead?
No, well, it's actually a great question. And so what I would ask you is that cannabis is a plant, and this is part of my research. It's a very, very sensitive plant. And if it was easy to grow cannabis at scale, the Canadians would be growing great cannabis right now. If it was easy to grow great cannabis in Massachusetts, Curaleaf would not be shutting down their capacity there. It is incredibly hard when you talk to private operators, you talk to anyone who is in the mix trying to grow cannabis at scale. It is an incredibly sensitive thing to do. Some people actually think it's impossible to make consistently great cannabis. And that's why some companies like MRMD or Grown Rogue are trying to just like, hey, we're just going to do a craft. Glasshouse is trying to be like, kind of like Budweiser or, maybe not Budweiser, maybe a step above Budweiser. But when you look at how sensitive cannabis is and the conditions that you need for cannabis, if you think about most of the cannabis is grown indoors, it's insane. Think about the energy that you need to keep there. They have indoor, grows in places like New Jersey, and like it gets really hot, it gets really cold. You know what the average temperature here is? It's 70 degrees. Do you know where there's no inflation? On the sun. So you have 70 degrees, like 320, 330 days a year of sunshine, perfect weather. You have a greenhouse surrounded by the perfect agriculture as far as you can see, because it's perfect agriculture land. So it never freezes, never gets hot, never really gets hot, though we did have remnants of a hurricane just come through, which was super strange. And you have a state-of-the-art greenhouse in one location where a robot cleans the roof, and so it allows sunlight, and it's built in a way to perfectly grow the plant down to like stuff like the boiler capacity is much higher, creates a heat canopy over the plant. It's not about cheap land. People have said, oh, look at this one company in Texas. And I was like, what's the weather in the summer? And they're like, oh, it's 95. Guess what? Guess what doesn't do well at 95-degree weather? Cannabis. And what you need is you're going to need air conditioning. What does air conditioning need? It needs energy. And then you're going to also need agriculture workers. The other thing people miss out is, where are the agriculture workers? You need to grow, you need people to process. This is one of the crazy things that Canada found out. There were literally stories where they planted a massive facility of cannabis and didn't realize they needed hundreds of people in like 45 days to harvest it. So I'd say is it's not as simple. It's not just land. It's not just capital. If that was the case, you'd see operational excellence everywhere. But instead, you need like perfect conditions. That's why most of it's grown indoors. And you also need operational excellence. People who really know how to grow it. It's not simple. It's very hard. And that's why I believe that when it's legalized, you're just going to have companies buy. And then what will happen is you'll probably just have a lot of operators on the West Coast, because you're just going to be utilizing the great weather in Oregon, in Northern California and Southern California. Could there be some operators in like Kentucky? Sure. In Texas, maybe. You need to be surrounded by agriculture. And people always forget that California is like a massive agriculture producer. It's not just wine grapes, it's avocados, it's almonds, it's lettuce. It's crazy amounts of agriculture that comes out of California. Why? The weather's perfect.
Aaron, I want to be respectful to your time. I know you said you wanted to get out of here at 9:45. Let me just ask you one quick last question. My feeling is, if you want to make money in this space, then you really got to be a stock picker. Like, what do you think about MSOS? Is that a way to gain the upside here, or do you have to be a stock picker? But we'll leave it with final thoughts on that.
I think it gives you exposure to the industry. There's a reason I started my fund, and I'm invested in the companies that I'm invested in. And that's because I believe in the strategies that they're executing. I'm just not much of a believer of how the strategies that the large MSOs are executing. And I don't know that it's sustainable.
Okay, got it. We got three good names from you: GLASF, MRMD, GRUSF, and people can follow you on Twitter at Aaron Value. Aaron Value, is that correct? AAR.
That's right. And you can also go to my Substack, which is mindsetvalue.substack.com, and just follow what I post.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron, so much. If you're watching this replay on YouTube, you can hop on over to StoryTrading, get a free trial to watch all of our events in real time, and make sure to follow us on at StoryTrading on YouTube and Twitter. Thanks again, Aaron, for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.